here, under subjective factor, we have the price of the product itself. That is, the objective factor is the price of the product itself. What determines the quantity demanded or purchased by the consumer is the price of the product itself. The price of the product itself. And the subjective factor, or that we call a shift factor, are the other factors that can also determine the demand. And one of them is what we mentioned now, that the substitute goods is also what? A subjective factor. A substitute goods, or the complementary here, substitute or complementary goods. It's part of the word. A subjective factor that determines the quantity demanded by the income and by the consumer. Sorry. Then we also have income of the consumer. The income of the consumer also determines the quantity purchased for a particular product. It is your income that will tell you that, oh, at this time I cannot use 13 Pro Pro because of the cost involved. Oh, I can only buy Techno. I can only buy Infinix phone as a result of the income coming in for the consumer. So the income of the consumer also determines the quantity purchased of what? Of a particular product, but this is fall under the subjective what? Factor. Another factor that can also determine this is the taste. Mention taste. The taste, preferences, and fashion. The taste of the consumer determine the quantity purchased for the product. Determine the quantity purchased for the product. And the preferences, maybe when you have the scale of preference, the priority on the goods you are buying, then you try to look at the one that is necessity now than the other one. So this also determines what we call the determinant of demand. So this four is one of those important determinant of demand that determine the quantity that the consumer is expected to buy at the end of the day. The price of the product itself. We also have the price of the substitute or the complementary goods. Then the income of the consumer, the taste preferences, and the fashion of the consumer also determine the quantity the consumer is expected to buy. Now, so we have expansion of an increase in demand. Expansion of an increase in demand. So let's take it one after the other. Let's say expansion. Expansion. Another name for expansion is change in quantity demanded. Change in quantity demanded. The change in quantity demanded is that more of a product will be purchased when the price of such product is less. That more of a product is purchased when the price of that product is less. And we can use this to illustrate this. This is price here. This is quantity here. Let's say we have this. We have this. So this is P2. Let's say this is P1, P2, Q1, Q2, right? So this is T, this is X. What this thing is saying is, you can see when the price of this product is A, the consumer is buying quantity 1. But when the price of this product drop from P1 to P2, the consumer is buying quantity 2. Class, take note of something here, that the movement of the price here is what we call expansion or change in quantity demanded. That is, more of a product will be purchased when the price of that product is less. And you can see it is the movement along the demand curve. And the only thing that can bring about the movement along the demand curve is the objective factors of demand. What do we call the objective factors of demand? The price of the product itself. That means it's only the price of the product itself that can bring about the change in quantity what demanded. It's only the price of the product itself, and it's a movement along the demand curve, or we call it change in quantity demanded. We call it change in quantity demanded. That is the movement along the demand curve. We can have more than 3, we can have 4, depend on the demand. Now, it moved from here to here, which means it's favorable to the consumer. It's favorable to the consumer. So the expansion means it's favorable to the consumer, that as the price is decreasing, the consumer was able to buy more of that product. Sometimes we call it a change in quantity demanded, which is a movement along the demand curve. Now, increase in demand. Increase in demand. Increase in demand. Another name for increased demand is change in demand. It's change in demand. And this can only, it's also favorable to the consumer, but it can only occur when one or other shift or subjective factors of demand is affected. It's affected. And the graph is like this. Let's say we have this. Class, what do you notice here? So you notice that the D naught here is the initial demand of the consumer, but suddenly it moved from D naught to D1, T to X, which means it's favorable to the consumer. The only thing that can bring about a change in quantity demanded or the outward in demand is the subjective factors of demand. A subjective factors of demand. And when this one is when it's moving upward, right? When it's moving upward, then the change in quantity or the subjective factor is favorable to the consumer. Maybe at this point now, the consumer is experiencing increase in his what? In his income. It's experiencing increase in his income and all that. So this is a favorable change in demand or increase in demand. So increase in demand or change in demand is bring about the entire shift in the demand curve. It brings about the entire shift in the demand curve. Why the movement along the demand is called expansion of demand and can only occur with the price of the product itself. So let's move to what and now another thing that I need to know here is there's something called a bandwagon effect here in economics. We call it a bandwagon effect. Now, a bandwagon effect means that people buy the product. It's not because the product is cheap, but because of the masses, because of the popularity, because majority people are buying that product. That is why they decided to buy the product. We call this to be a bandwagon effect. And this will be the effect. It's going to push the entire grab demand upward, or probably there will be a favorable in the movement of demand as a result of the price of the product. So we have what we call a bandwagon effect. That is, people buy the product not because the product is cheap or the product is cost, but because of the popularity, but because of the masses are buying that product. That makes them to consume the product. So the second to the last, we have what we call a contraction and decrease in demand. Now, another name for contraction to class is also a change in quantity demanded, right? It's also a change in quantity demanded, but the only difference between this and the other one is expansion is favorable to the consumer, while the contraction here is what? Unfavorable to the consumer. Here now, it is also this objective factor that determines this. But when the consumer experiences this, That means the price is increasing, that make the consumer to buy less of the product. That means the price is increasing, that make the consumer to buy less of that product. Let's say we have this demand, this. When the price is 1 naira here, the consumer buy this, then the price increase to 2 naira, then is buying this. You can see the movement. The movement here is the same thing as the movement along the demand curve. The movement along the demand curve. So when you have this scenario now, it means that the price of the product itself is not favorable to the consumer. It means the price of the product itself is not favorable to the consumer, and it's also the movement along the demand curve. But which movement? It moves from right to left. From right to left. Why the other one that we call expansion is moving from left to right, and it's favorable to the consumer. Now, the decrease in demand. The decrease in demand. Another name for decrease in demand is also a change in demand. Change in demand. Class, we say that a change in demand brings about entire shift in the demand curve. It brings about entire shift in the demand curve. But the last time, right, it's favorable to the consumer. But when we have a contraction here, meaning those subjective factor is not favorable to the consumer. Those subjective factor here will now be 1, where will be not, right? So when you trace it down like this, let's say here is Q1, then when you trace it down, here is what? Q2. So we have TN. You can see what happened. You have inward. We have inward in, excuse me class, we have inward in the graph, the demand graph, right? Which means all the subjective factor is not favorable to the consumer. So this occur when, for example, that the income of the consumer has dropped. The taste, the preferences, the price of, the price of the related goods or the complementary, the income of the consumer has decreased. So this happens. So it's not all the time that the customer used to experience what we call a favorable demand. It can also be what? Inward. So when we have the inward, we call it a decrease in demand or change in quantity or demanded. And another effect we have for this, we call it a snub effect. Another snub effect, we call this to be a proud rich people. A proud rich people. But people, at this point now, people will decide not to buy a product as the result of the popularity of people demanding for that product. We have some people like that. We call them in economics a proud rich people, that they will decide not to buy a particular product because many people are consuming that product. Because many people are consuming the product, right? And this is what the end result for that product. Now, class, the last one, market demand. What do we call a market demand? A market demand is simple. It's just like the total demand of all the consumer for a particular goods. It's just the total demand of all the consumer for a particular goods. Let's say we have this demand for consumer A. We have quantity here. We have price here. Then we have another one for the B. And then we call this one to be figure B. Quantity. Then we have the price here. Then we have the last one to be for C. For C, we have demand. And we have this. So the combination of the demand of each consumer, the combination of the three, the demand by this consumer is what we call a market demand. A market demand. The combination of the purchases of that particular goods is what we call what? A market demand. Class, I believe with this we gain something. So I will advise that you should just click like and subscribe so that you can have access to other videos that will be posted subsequently. Then if you have any question, you can put on the comment. You can put on the comment so that I will respond to your question. If there is need for me to do a video to respond to you, I will do it. Then we are good to go. Thank you very much. I still remain myself. Bashir Ibrahim is my name, and I'll very soon will send another video. Thank you.